Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Hostel from 2005. Kind of funny, I just keep stumbling upon more Eli Roth films. Like, it isn't a goal in mind to go and find these movies. It's like they're finding me for whatever reason. So, like, because I'm just like, oh yeah, like, hey, this movie exists. Hey, this movie exists. And then all of a sudden I just keep stumbling upon these Eli Roth films and not even realizing it until later on, where I'm like, oh yeah, I guess this is an Eli Roth film because he's in the actual film. There we are again. Because I recently reviewed like Cabin Fever and all these kind of dark, gritty horror films, and this is another one of those where it's just this really dark um, kind of approach of a European vacation. Because I think right around this time we ended up having a movie in the year before that I think was called Euro Trip, where I think that kind of sums up, like, we had these movies where I think we had like road trips and then we had like Euro trips, and then all of a sudden we just kind of continued on this pattern of like, hey everybody, let's all go into this vacation, let's all go to these spots, let's all and we're even still kind of doing this kind of thing now, where everybody is to go onto a tropical island, just be like, oh my god, this is like the happiest days of my life. If I could die here right now, like, because that's possibly going to happen. I will be the happiest that I've ever been, and hopefully don't die horribly and torturously like I would die in a Hostel movie, but that's just bound to happen. So going into this film, really, if Euro Trip is to be like, yeah, go to these places, see these things that you wouldn't have been able to see in America, this movie is to be like, yeah, maybe you should think twice about doing and going to all those places. Because more than likely, you're going to end up dead. You're going to end up just, like, torturously dead. Maybe maybe you should really double check your vacation spot. Maybe you should really just uh, reconsider where you're being guided to. And that's the thing that I think I enjoy about this film, because I don't like the fact where we have like, not the fact that this is an overseas vacational thing. No, I Europe, thumbs up. I love Europe. Europe is great. Norway, British, UK, France, all everywhere. Sweden, um, anywhere else in that vicinity. Um, the thing that I like, I want to see the opposite, to where it's like, hey, like, instead of just going out and going onto this road trip, I want to see that a road trip is a mistake. I want to see that eventually going on to a European vacation is a mistake, so that way you can second guess what you're going to do. The thought process that kind of goes into these kind of movies, instead of going into the, oh yeah, just go on the road trip and have the fun and like everything will just work itself out. Like, I like to have a movie make you think about a decision that you had made. To eventually you would just be like, oh yeah, like a vacation would be the greatest thing to do, until you watch this film. So that's what I like about it. It really is just to be a kind of cautious reminder to just be smart on your vacations if you are to take one. Especially once we get closer to holidays, and especially when we get closer to certain kind of things. Like, I think that's why I like to put these movies out a little bit more, because, like, really, like, you end up seeing these like family reunion kind of films, like await further instructions, and eventually that goes horribly awry. And so I think I just like those kind of things where it's just to uh, always kind of keep in the back of your mind to just be suspicious of all. So, with that said, what is this movie about besides just going into Europe, which again, big Europe guy, freaking. I had supposedly heard through some certain kind of survey somewhere where supposedly Swedish women are to be the women that are, I guess, to supposedly give it up the most. Which I guess I'd be like, well, I guess I would have to ask a Swedish woman eventually if that is true. But uh, what a weird survey. Um, but yeah, so really, this is a very interesting film because we get to see stuff, of course, that we wouldn't normally get to see in a lot of films. Not just American, like, oh, like this is something I don't get to see because I usually get to see American films. No, like this is something that I don't get to see because this is to be a unique like film. I think the only film that feels familiar to this is possibly Hatchet, and that's about it. Like everything else is to just be kind of like one and the same kinds of films at some point. But I don't know. Maybe there's a lot more people that have seen these kinds of films, and let me know in the comments below if there's a movie similar to this. I'm like, oh yeah, I probably had seen that. Like it's a good thing that you said something because it wouldn't have popped into my head. But anyways, teeing it up quickly. What is this movie about? So these three guys who are to go on to vacation are to make it to Amsterdam to seemingly go and smoke weed and eventually want to get laid. So these guys go further and further into Amsterdam to try and find a place where the women are going to easily throw themselves at seemingly any guy who is to have a accent of sorts. And so eventually these guys are to head to this location to eventually one by one have seemingly one of these three guys start to go missing. All of a sudden it ends at first being this guy named Ollie, then it ends up being Josh, then eventually we have just Paxton left. And so eventually it's to be the mystery, the wanting to figure out like why the heck that these friends are to go missing. And that's what kind of makes this an interesting film, to eventually go and find their friend again, where it seems like there is this rat race or this chase around where eventually we are to figure out this whole mystery of what's really going on until eventually we are to finally be really and truly delivered into what is really going on. And we end up seeing a lot of rich businessmen of sorts that are to eventually make their way into some kind of darkened, dungeoned place where they are going to be spending their money to slowly but surely take down the minutes of someone's life. So, I think that's all I want to say in a very cryptic like sense of this movie, and I had to like phrase that in a weird, goofy way. But like, really, it's better to explain this movie because eventually I'll run out of things to say in spoilers. So let's go into it. It's about that customary time yet again to go into this thing called spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time getting to spoil this movie. One thing before I go, where can you go to see this film? And also, how did I feel about this film? And also, basically, the only reason to actually watch this film is because there's a cluster of sex moments, topless women, and so if you are into that kind of thing, because people are all kinds of branches of life, then by golly, this movie might be for you. It's weighing the options of, do you like a torturous film, but do you also like topless women? Weigh your options. But also, do you like a European film, which a lot of people, or a kind of Europe sampling kind of film, which there's that also. But how did I actually feel about this film? Like, I would say that I would say that this is kind of a. I would say that this probably has to be a good film because one, you get all these interesting vacational things that these people are to do, and the only like real downside of this movie is to I don't like I don't like in horror movies when someone ever in a horror film has to beg for their life. Because usually, like, especially when we get to part two of Hostel, where they kind of focus on the kind of killing side of it instead of the victim side of it. Like in this, especially part two, like I just really got annoyed with part two because people were begging for their life for far too long, and I was like, oh my god, like this is getting just so annoying. Because in a normal horror movie, I don't like when people are to beg for their life. Like, yeah, I don't want someone to suffer in silence, but like I also like I never like movies whatsoever or shows or anything when you have a person going off continuously begging for their life. It's just a thing where I'm just like, kill them already. Do it. Like it's always the please no no please no 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 please no please no 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 like, or it's always the screaming the like freaking chalkboard screaming, and you're just like, God, could you just please? Like if anything, like if I were the killer, I'd be like putting in some like freaking some some ear some ear things in my ear to just like, dude, I'm not gonna hear whatever you're gonna say. Sadly, I'm not gonna listen. Like it's like that's the whole thing. I don't like the buildup of the kill. Probably hence why I don't usually go into a lot of torture movies because I don't like the build up. The please no 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 please no no no. Get to it. Kill them. Um, sure, slice them a couple times and whatever, but like get the job done. Don't make them beg for like 20 more minutes and just like within their fear kind of thing. That just gets annoying to me. Where you end up having a killer that is to like play with its food, and the person's like, please no 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 no, and then like yeah, the killer's like, yeah, like, and they're doing that for like 20 minutes. I'm like, man, you guys just have some time to kill. Come on, get to it. Sadly enough, because there is no reasoning with a killer and a victim. Like, I don't get what these people in their mind think when they're in a horror movie. I guess it's just like, hey man, we have some time to kill. Could you throw in 85 more no 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 nos in this film, in this part? Because we have nothing better. We have nothing left to eventually kind of. We just got to stretch out. Come on. The one scene that we had at the bar, like, only took 10 minutes. Come on. Please, no, no, no's. Come on. Give them to me. So, so yeah. So where can you watch this film? Right now, currently, it's on Peacock for whatever weird reason. Peacock is a weird app. It's a weird called app. But anyways, we also have really there's a number of apps that I can suggest to you that over time you can unwind and eventually see any number of things, new releases for absolutely free, all kinds of things. You could probably see this app on TV Crush, Crush with a C. You could also go and possibly see this app on any number of other apps, possibly. Fox HD Movies, if you go and Google search that, you'll go through the logo instead of the title because it won't say the exact Fox HD Movies. Letter C Movies, Letter C, so C Movies. That's an app that I would say Google search it, and you should possibly be able to find any number of films. But go on to Peacock, especially if you already have the app, anyways, because you might have gone and watched Halloween Kills, and you might as well try to get your money's worth out of that app, possibly, because I think that's the only real legitimate new release from Peacock. But anyways, let's go on to that double five time territory because it's a customary time yet again to go and spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time to spoil this movie. So we have Ollie, Josh, and Paxton who are to seemingly make their way to Amsterdam. And so immediately these guys are just like, hey man, we need to get freaking weeded up. Weeded up to the seeded up, if you know what I mean. We need to get like we need to get all kinds of weed all up inside of us. So these guys, I guess, head into this cafe or anywhere basically at some point to just get this thing called marijuanas or the weed or whichever. I don't know why I have to like have some weird lingo in here. I should just say these people want to get high, so they're going to a place, probably a cafe or some kind of weird mixture of things. So after this whole weed experiment, where these guys are starting to get really high, all of a sudden they're like, well, hey man, like where can we go next to eventually go and possibly find some women? Because eventually Josh, who is to have had some lady troubles, is to eventually want to uh, kind of get over that hump, so to speak, or that dry spell of not being a woman or not being a woman, not being with a woman. Josh has that problem. There might be some problems, and anyway, I said something wrong there. I apologize. Uh, Josh evidently was with somebody, and they broke up, and so Paxton is trying to get Josh to get back into the bedroom, so to speak. So these three guys eventually go off to this club where where eventually Josh is to accidentally bump into this one man. And so Josh is to have this like weird confidence in himself to almost go into a fight with this very large man. And so but all three of these guys end up getting thrown out. And here's the thing. So Ollie, who is I guess from Iceland, is to right away just be banging some woman in this bathroom stall, and he ends up taking a picture of it and sending it to his friends, just like, yeah, look at me. And so both Paxton and Josh is just like, oh my god, like man, this guy does not like, this guy does not disappoint. So eventually all three of these guys are to uh, eventually head to this red light district to eventually find these women. And so Ollie is to go and pay for these two guys to otherwise get busy with these women. So eventually Josh is to all of a sudden kind of stumble through this hallway where he's kind of hearing noises of somebody getting beaten up. So Josh opens this door and is to have this woman just beating the crap out of this man. And she's like, hey, like, get out of here. You don't pay, you no play kind of thing. So Josh is like, okay, all right, I'm not going to pay. So Paxton is to go with Josh to be like, hey man, like that's your room down the hall there. Like we've geared this up for you. Like go and like get back on the horse, so to speak. So both Ollie and Paxton are to go into the room that Josh interrupted. And so like, hey, we're gonna pay, we'll get involved. So Josh goes down to the room to, I believe, not actually go through the act, and really eventually they go and they go off. And so Paxton is asking Josh like, well, how was it? And Josh is like, it's okay. Like Paxton, like, you didn't go through it, did you? I knew you, I know you. So all of a sudden Ollie is to go on and find this guy who is to be Alex. And so because eventually we have like them kind of window shopping through these red light districts. And so eventually they eventually go into this room with this guy named Alex, where it seems that these two people are just going at it. And supposedly Alex is like, yeah, like they don't even know really right now what their what planet they're even on, let alone anything. So they're just going at it, and like you can just go ahead and watch. Like weirdly, we have this guy who has this like bunk bed set up, and like these two are just going at it because it's hostile. So Alex is to eventually tell these guys, it's like, well, hey, you guys are like Americans, right? And so Paxton and Josh are like, well, yeah, we're both Americans. Ollie's from Iceland. And so Alex is like, well, perfect. Because coincidentally, there is to be this place where it seems that eventually when women are to all of a sudden hear that American accent, they are just like, oh my God, like Americans. And they will throw themselves at you and so on and so forth. And so, like, Alex is like, yeah, go ahead and check this place out uh, because we have this kind of scenario that is to be kind of presented as like this Taken kind of scenario. Have the one guy who's to be the kind of fisherman, and eventually is to kind of pull these guys in to have them be uh, taken to the to eventually fish out the bigger fish, so to speak. So what I'm saying here is Alex is to be the fisherman that goes and gets a small fish and then takes that smaller fish to give it to a person that is to be another fisherman who fishes for bigger fish using this small fish, like a shark or any absurd bigger sized things, like a whale. Like a fisherman just gets whales and just pulls them out of the waters. The waters. Metaphor is lost here. Oh well. So these three guys head to this one location that Alex is to mention, and so they go and they do this reservation by this desk clerk. Oh, they end up also having to take a train to get to this location, and they end up meeting this Dutch businessman who is to go and eat his salad with his fingers. And so they're like, hey man, you need a fork? Because we can easily just find a fork where we are to be at. And this Dutch businessman is like, no, I like to eat my food with my hands because we have to realize that any number of these things had given up their lives for us to consume it. So like I was thinking about this. I'm like, dude, this guy's technically like there's some probably some meat in there. There's some turkey and whatever, but like this whole thing is a salad. I'm like, what are you saying there, buddy? Like what like what do you mean by giving up their lives? But when really thinking about it, like if like a salad is like a leaf from a tree, and you pull that leaf away from the tree, you're technically ending its growth or ending its expansion point. So I guess that could technically be its life, as well as any kind of fruit, plant, whatever. So technically, for any person that I guess is to be a vegan, like you're ending some kind of life in my metaphorical process. But a lot of people could probably just say, well, like a leaf is dead. It's like, well, technically a tree isn't. Like, so I'm horrible. Anyways, so I apologize to a person who is vegan, or anyone who is to be a vegetarian of any kind, and they might see that differently. Because people would take the opposite spectrum of meat and all that kind of, which I can completely understand. Moving on. So meat is unhealthy for whoever you would probably ask. Anyways, pushing on. Now I'm making both sides of the table mad. Meat eater, me. I eat whatever is to be in front of me, which is most of the time to not be salad, and it should be. Pushing on. So, I'm sorry. Uh, But pushing on. So it feels like I had an agenda there, which I didn't. I didn't at all. But why do we keep going to this? Move on. So these guys are to be on this train, and this weird salad hand man who is to eat salad with his hands instead of a fork. Uh, I also don't like plastic forks. I don't like plastic like stuff, silverware, nothing. I hate that garbage. When I was in school, I was like, God, this is such a like silverware, plastic silverware freaking sucked. I wanted to bring in metal like stuff, or I was just eating finger food like pizzas and whatever to just avoid that garbage. So, but we end up having this Dutch businessman who is to all of a sudden go and touch Josh on the thigh. And so Josh is like, what the heck? You touching me on my thigh? How could you? And so all of a sudden this Dutch businessman is like, oh, I'm sorry. And then he ends up like backing away and just walking off. Because obviously Josh is to be offended by a thigh grab. So, wouldn't you be? Wouldn't you be? So, especially of course if it wasn't a lover or a potential lover or a person that you would have just spent more than a minute or two with. Pushing on. So, we also had this moment where Josh was to eventually fall asleep, and so Ollie is to basically like push his butt right next to Josh's face with these weird googly eyes drawn on it for whatever reason. And so eventually Ollie comes back to that when eventually they're to go to this spa of sorts. So so these guys eventually are to find this place. They are to check in uh, with this desk clerk, and so they end up going off to go and make it to the room where coincidentally two women are to weirdly enough be seemingly shirtless, and then all of a sudden are just like, oh hey yeah, like you guys can have the room, zip. And they kind of just walk off, and the guys are like, hey. So like, hey, where are you girls going? And they're like, we're going to the spa. And so all three of the guys end up going to the spa. And so eventually they start to talk and get to know one another, and all of a sudden the girls start to realize that these guys are from Iceland and America, and so they're like, ooh. So we have these girls that are to take these guys to this club. I want to say it's like a disco, but I don't think they actually did that. Disco? No disco? Pushing on. So we have these characters going to this club, and so we had Ollie, who is to have his invitation as the king of swing. Like, man, that's gotta be a real that's gonna be real interesting because kind of when you look at characters like the WWE character like Cesaro, and like he ends up I think calling himself like something around like that, where it's just like, okay, so we just have like these kind of funny nicknames that eventually but everybody has nicknames, but whatever, still what am I to say about my weird goofy nickname? So but I just was like, hey man, like this guy is to basically tell you this guy has some confidence and give it to him because he is just making some headway. So Ali eventually is to mix it up with the girl that is to be the kind of the clerk that is to usher everybody in the beginning of this, and then we end up having some desk clerk after that. So this girl behind this counter is to be Volley or Valley, Vala, Vala, whatever you want to call her. And she is to be mixing it up with Ollie, and so eventually these guys are to start getting really drunk and kind of getting really kind of in the mood, so to speak. So now we have both Paxton and we have Josh who are to go back to the room with Natalia and Sislana. There we go. And going and getting into some bedroom business and so on and so forth. I'll leave it at that because I try to refrain from trying to say any number of certain kind of acts of sorts because that'll be deemed by YouTube like of just like, oh, you said a thing, you did a stuff, whatever. Just come on, YouTube, give me a break, cut me some slack. So feels like anybody else can get through any rung of things and say whatever they want. But pushing on. So eventually both Josh uh, and Paxton are to eventually wake up the next day to find Ollie seemingly gone. It seemed that both Josh and Paxton are to eventually ask the desk clerk, "Hey, where is Ollie?" Like, and supposedly this guy had said that Ollie had checked out, and they're like, "Okay, that seems weird." So we seemingly have a girl named, I believe her name is Kana. That would be correct. Kana, who is to go with both Paxton and Josh, and are to send them a picture with both Ollie and Kana at this one location site. And so Paxton is like, okay, this is weird. So Paxton says, hey, how about you go and give me the picture through the phone? Can you do that for me? And she ends up sending him that. And he's like, okay, great, thank you. Because evidently Kana doesn't speak English that well, and so they're like trying to figure out how they can talk with this woman. So to try to like figure out how they can kind of help one another out. Because eventually she ended up losing her friend with Ollie, a girl named Yuki. When both Yuki and Ollie went to this one location and had gone missing. So eventually now both Josh and Paxton are eventually going to this disco, and because the girls are still wanting to just like, hey, let's party, let's go and get some acid and all kinds of things, and let's still try to enjoy this time here. And Paxton is also telling Josh, it's like, well, hey, like, just F Ollie right now. Like, if anything, like, we've left him numerous notes. We've told him where we're going, and we've tried to call him and no answer. Like, if anything, maybe because we find out in the train that Ollie is to have a daughter. We find that out, and so like Paxton is thinking of any number of scenarios that maybe Ollie just had to run off because maybe he had a family emergency or any number of things. And so, or maybe his phone died or whichever. Maybe he's in the gutter somewhere. So, excuse me. So, Paxton is telling Josh, you know what, like, let's enjoy another night here before, like, eventually our vacation just runs out. How about we just enjoy the time that we have here? So they go off to this disco. They end up getting kind of as wasted as they can possibly get with certain kind of drugs and alcohol and all kinds of things. So eventually what or how this all plays out is that eventually Josh is to eventually be kind of upset that his friend Ollie is still missing. And so eventually with him being drunk, Josh is to eventually just tell the girls, is like, you know what, I'm just going to go back into the apartment. I'm not feeling well. I'm going to try to make it back to the apartment. And so Josh tells Paxton that, and he's just like, okay, like, you wussy, like, hey man, like, we can still get it with these women and whatever. But coincidentally, Paxton is to also eventually end up getting seemingly way drunk also, and then he ends up going into this storage room where he finds himself accidentally locked in, and he falls over and passes out. So what ends up happening is Josh is to wake up in a chair like this, to slowly but surely be tortured by, of course, um, the Duchess businessman that we saw earlier in the train, where this guy is to go into taking this drill and drilling into parts of this guy's body, like his thighs, his arms, his chest, so on and so forth. Numerous drills through this guy's body, and then after that, we have this businessman that goes and cuts the ankles of Josh, and I'm like, ew! Like, I think the very first time that I saw this movie and I saw the ankle cutting, I'm like, oh my god. But it was, oh my, but like, realize it, because it was the first time I ever saw it, and I was like, oh, they're doing that in this movie. But eventually, once you, like, just, like, you have to, like, remember all of this is to be, like, of course, movie magic, like they say. But still, like, it still looks gruesome. So the Duchess businessman is to take the cuffs off of Josh and is to demand for him to try and escape. He opens the door for him and like, hey, try to escape. So Josh all of a sudden tries to stand up and starts to walk and falls over and is now not only that, like, Josh, I think once he was starting to get drilled into, eventually all of a sudden Josh starts Ralphing it up, and it seems that he won't be Ralphing alone, so to speak. I'm like, why does everybody have to barf in this scenario? Like, I understand maybe you're like the torture of it all or whatever, or just the gruesomeness of it all, but like everybody's just barfing it out. Like, I don't know, maybe some people have that kind of thing in them or whichever. Or maybe it's just some kind of something that eventually they're just like, hey man, barf it out. So maybe it's the pain of it all. I don't know. Maybe the pain is too much. But yeah, so Josh is to eventually go and try to make his way sliding out this way to eventually have us really just realize he's not getting out of this room. He's not going to escape. And so this Dutch businessman is to, of course, go and end this by slicing Josh's throat, killing him, of course. So, excuse me. So, now, we also have Ollie, who is to either send Paxton or Josh at some point, having some weird photo of sorts that just says that he went home, and it's just a picture of his severed head, and his eyes are closed weirdly because his head is severed. So, because I guess these guys were consistently asking for this Ollie character, so I guess they had to come up with some kind of proof that this guy was dead. This guy was gone because this guy was trying to be found. So now we only have Paxton left out of this group, and so all of a sudden Paxton is to head back into the hotel, and so what ends up happening is Paxton heads back to find out that he had checked out of his room. And so Paxton is like, wait a minute, like, checked out of my room? I didn't check out of my room. What are you guys talking about? This doesn't make any sense. He's kind of bickering with this man, and then we start to see this kind of pattern starting to emerge. Because eventually when Paxton is to say, well, hey man, I need another room for tonight, because I'm waiting for my other friend. So Paxton is to go back into this other room where conveniently he is to see these two women that, of course, are topless yet again, going and zipping up these shirts and saying that they're going to the spa. And Paxton is like, oh, so there is just some kind of trickery going on here. It seems that eventually they naturally assumed that I wouldn't be coming back a second time around. What is going on? So eventually Paxton is to eventually ask her friend, uh, or her friend, his friend Kana about like, well, hey, uh, did you ever find your friend? Like, do you want to come with me to eventually try to see if we can find our friend together? So on and so forth. But Kana is like, well, hey, I don't speak English and I just don't. So Paxton is just like, well, okay, like, at least I tried kind of thing. So, uh, so eventually, at some point, we also find Yuki, who had been sold by, or had been bought by some person to eventually be tortured and eventually be killed. So, like, we don't see it as prominent as probably a number of the other characters that eventually do, like Josh and Ollie, but like we, of course, get to see kind of Yuri, kind of like in this quick scene where eventually she's going to get killed. So Paxton is to eventually go off to go and find uh, both Natalia and Svetlana, and to ask them like, "Hey, where is my friend? Where are my friends?" So both these girls weirdly had gone from like full on makeup and all of this stuff to all of a sudden now they're kind of very much like without makeup whatsoever, and just to showcase that more than likely they had to put together this con to eventually have these guys be like, like these girls are good looking and they're always topless and woohoo. So these girls were putting up this act to eventually, and now that they're kind of on their own and they're kind of away from performing this act, you get to see who they really are. So Paxton is to eventually go to these girls and is like, hey, where's my friends? And so Natalia is just be like, well, they went somewhere. Like, like they went somewhere. They're off somewhere. And so Paxton is like, well, where? Like, I fell asleep in some storage thing the night before, and like I don't know where my friends are. And so eventually Natalia is to mention that like, well, they're to be at this museum. I'll go and I'll help you figure out where that is. So both Natalia and Paxton are to head to this museum, and so Paxton is trying to start to ask Natalia questions, and so Paxton goes and is to question one of the guys that is going into this museum, but it's kind of like this vague thing where Paxton is just to ask this guy, like, how is it in there? And so the guy is to be like, well, yeah, don't spend your money all in one place kind of thing. Because it'll, like, you'll be so incentivized to want to spend all your money in this place. So Paxton is just like, okay, whatever that means. So eventually Paxton heads in there to where eventually he is to be taken down one way or another to be put in this room. And so Natalia is to mention to Paxton that she's gotten so much money from him. Like, ha ha ha, gotcha. So now we have Paxton in this room who is unfortunately going to get tortured. So this guy who is going to kill off Paxton is to be this German guy, I believe. Yeah, German guy who is to like start talking German at some point because evidently he doesn't speak English. Uh, Eventually, Paxton is to speak English because evidently he knows English. So, or Paxton is to speak German because he knows German. And so Paxton is to go on and try to talk to this guy, convincing him to stop killing him. And so this German guy comes back with this gag to give to Paxton to just shut him up. It's like, dude, I know you're American. The wallet ends up saying that you're American. The guy said that you're American, so you're an American, so you're gonna die. So the first thing that we start off with is to kind of have this guy kind of pick and choose which weapon that he really wants to use on this guy. Uh, it seems that eventually he, at first, kind of goes for something nice and something kind of just kind of a poker kind of thing to see what is to happen with this guy as he begs for his life. But then eventually this guy's just excuse me is to decide to transition from this little poker thing, which I thought was stupid, to eventually just have this chainsaw, which I'm like, oh my god, this guy is just gonna get freaking brutally chopped up. Oh my god, and it's probably not gonna be easy death either. Because even with chainsaws, like, I'll go and I'll watch like a chainsaw movie and I'll feel nothing. But like the horribly slow death of a thing, uh or eventually like certain items, it's just like you kind of cringe when there are certain items in play where eventually you're just like, man, however like this person is gonna die, it's gonna be awful. And chainsaws are always one of those where it's just like, oh my god. Like, plus also like a chainsaw like basically cuts through anything anyway, so if you're trying to escape from a chainsaw, good luck with that. uh that chainsaw can make it through anything. um but yeah, so uh chainsaw. So we have this guy who has this chainsaw and is to all of a sudden just start zooming it away. And we have here that Paxton ends up getting some fingers lobbed off. And so he easily ends up getting away from his handcuffs. And so eventually this all leads with Paxton eventually going and kind of overpowering this guy and eventually having him chainsaw himself. And so while Paxton goes and picks up his fingers, eventually there is to be this security guy that ends up running in that Paxton ends up shooting, because this German guy was eventually going to use this gun but decided not to. So Paxton knows there's a gun in the room. So Paxton eventually is to run off to go and make his way through this facility to eventually seemingly find this other room of these kind of attires for these killer men. So he ends up weirdly just starting to dress as these killers, and he has this like weird nightly helmet kind of thing, which eventually he ends up going to this one storage place that ends up having all these like bodies lying around, and he goes onto this flatbed, which if you don't know what this is, it's like a little cart dealie that they kind of just stroll around. I call it a flatbed because uh, like I had worked in retail for a number of years, so I usually say certain lingos and then I have to explain those lingos because whatever. So, because I have to, because it's just like, probably people won't know what a flatbed is called. But anyways, so I might as well just say a cart because that's a easier English term. So Paxton is getting carted around to eventually be dumped off with all parts of his body, and so eventually Paxton is to go and murder off this guy who is to be tossing all these body pieces around. Excuse me. Sorry about all the coughing that I'm doing here. So Paxton eventually is to go on to this locker room and eventually find all these rich guys' clothing and starts to put it on. All of a sudden, we end up having this American businessman who kind of comes in there and is starting to, of course, own the room. Just because Rick Hoffman tends to do that a lot. Like I've seen Rick Hoffman in movies like Condemned, where like he's just a real like big presence in a movie, and that's the thing that I always like about Rick Hoffman is because he always just like wherever part that he's always to be in, like he is to just be the most interesting. Like he kind of steals things. Like he kind of steals things from people because like he's just that good. And I wish Rick Hoffman was in a lot more stuff because I just really like, especially when he's usually play like the bad guy of things. I wish like he would have been in a lot more kind of bad guy scenarios. Um, but anyways, pushing on. So, uh, the American businessman is to just kind of like ask Hoffman or Hoffman Paxton like a number of questions. Uh, or Paxton numerous questions, just asking him like, "Hey man, how was it in there? Like, where's your tattoo? What should I do in there? What should I do? Should I go in there guns blazing, or should I just like slow and methodical and whatever? Should I beat them to death? What should I do? What should I like?" So Paxton is just like, "Well, quick, right? Like, shoot them, right?" And so Hoffman's like, "No, I'm gonna want to get a real piece of me. Come on!" So he just starts running out there. So Paxton is just like, "I'm gonna get the out of here." Like, and so supposedly Hoffman had mentioned that he had like really been marinating on waiting for this candidate for him to go and kill. So eventually Paxton is to eventually go on and to try and make it his way out of here. But then all of a sudden, Paxton is to hear a screaming coming from spot, luckily that he is to be at, to eventually find Kana or Kana. We find her being killed by seemingly Hoffman, the guy that I had just spotted. And so Paxton is to all of a sudden go and interrupt this whole spot. And Hoffman's like, "Hey man, get your own." And so all of a sudden Paxton goes off and shoots Hoffman. Or am I even saying that? Yeah, Hoffman. And then eventually saves Kana. But Kana is to have this like eye dribbling from one of her eyelids. I'm like, "Oh my god. Yipers. Yikes." Oh, just the dripping of eyes. Because and we had the gruesome moment where like Paxton's like, "What do I do? What do I do?" And she's like, "Ah!" She's like screaming, and so she's not really moving. And so Paxton just decides to just cut her eye off. And so all of a sudden we had this like yellow goop that ends up falling out, which I don't know what that yellow goop was, but eye stuff. So both of these characters are to run off to eventually go and find a car, drive off, make their way the heck out of here. So these characters don't immediately go to a hospital because really they have no real place to go when they are to be still around this place, because we start ending up having people looking for them. And so eventually their idea is to go to this train station, and so all of a sudden there's to be a bunch of these guys all going through these trains and train stations, trying to find these people to see if they're going to jump to get the heck out of here, because it's the only real place left to get to. Because eventually Paxton and Kana are driving off to make it to this spot, and they end up seeing, of course, the three that had basically brought them to this location, which is, I think, to be Alex, Natalia, and Svetlana. And so Paxton decides to eventually run them all down and then backs over them to make sure they're all dead. And so then he ends up driving off to, like, we have this spot where these kids are all to just demand candy or they're just going to beat these people up. And so luckily, Paxton is to have all this candy that he chucks to these kids. So now all these kids are to protect Paxton and Kana to make their way out, while these people with these other cars are now having to eventually battle these kids and getting beaten up and whatever. So Paxton and Kana make it to this train station, and all of a sudden, Kana is to see her reflection in this piece of glass where she's to realize that she is now disfigured. And so Kana is to now just be in such a way of just like, oh my god, like I am going to remember this moment for the rest of my life. That like even though I had survived, like I'm still going to just see this disfigurement every time that I'm to look in the mirror every single day. So Kana decides that she's going to jump in front of a train and die. And so then eventually while that's going on, eventually Paxton is to go onto a train and try to get the heck out of here. So eventually Paxton is to be on this train where all of a sudden he ends up bumping into this Dutch businessman. And so Paxton is to eventually follow this guy and eventually follow him into the bathroom where this guy's going to take a dump. And so Paxton is to have the card of this society that this guy had mixed himself up with. So Paxton had dumped the card next to this guy's stall, and so the Dutch guy is like, "Oh my god, like what I guess he's a member, or maybe I did something wrong, or whichever." So this guy has to go and pick up the card, or maybe he thought that he had dropped this card. And so this guy picks it up to have Paxton go and grab this guy's hand and chop off his fingers, and then eventually go quickly into the stall to then go and take this guy and drown him into this toilet and eventually cut off his throat with this scalpel. Because when Paxton is to eventually go into the train, he's holding this scalpel as a defensive thing for anyone that is to kind of bum rush into this door because Paxton is completely paranoid. So after this kind of whole revenge moment, eventually Paxton is to eventually go upon another train, I guess, to just vanish forever, because this guy probably is to probably figure out some way to eventually get some kind of license or something like that. Maybe he goes back to the American embassy and heads back home or whatever. But with that said, we don't get to see him ever again in this series or whatever. We don't find out that eventually he became a killer or whatever because maybe he like tasted it and just couldn't shake it off or something like that. But no, that's the way of which that this movie is to end. I'm gonna get out of here because this review is far long enough. I think I covered almost everything, but maybe not everything perfectly done. But whatever. Like I feel good enough about this one, so I'm gonna call it a day. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.